Hi, this is group 2 for the leadership challenge number 3. This is me. If we want to go around and introduce ourselves.
This is Janelle Walton.
This is Brock Hansen.
And I'm Anders Peterson.
So this question is, how can I positively influence my community practice through participation in broader configurations of networks? And I would like to start with this quote on page 103. Joining a community practice involves entering not only its internal configuration, but also its relations with the rest of the world. So through that is when we are being part of the community practice, we're definitely dealing with the internal aspects of it, but there's also other things going on in the broader aspects of it. Any thoughts?
Well, I was reading the prologue. It states that community practices are an integral part of our lives, and we belong to different kinds of communities of practice at home, at work, and other organizations. And my belief is that if we're going to positively influence our community practice through participation in broader configurations of networks, we need to start at home. And anything that we do in our local setting will radiate outwards. What comes to mind is a quote on page 186. It's the work of alignment. It says, alignment requires the ability to coordinate perspectives and actions in order to direct energies to a common purpose. The challenge of alignment is to connect local efforts to broader styles and discourses in ways that allows learners to invest their energy in them. So coordinating our abilities in our community practice, and then that will radiate outwards to broader communities of practice or networks.
I agree with that. On page 218, I found the quote, in this regard, I have argued that multi-membership is a critical source of learning because it forces an alignment of perspectives and the negotiation of an engaged identity. Identity then becomes a living bridge, the dynamic locus of alignment, the subject and the object of the work of reconciliation necessary to bring diverging perspectives together, understanding them through each other and find a way to engage them with one another. I think that's really crucial as we're working within our communities and also with other networks and bringing them together, especially in partnerships and tackling tough issues.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback Janelle on that one too. Is that more from a kind of personal perspective and just from my experiences that it's incredibly true, and from the standpoint that when you connect people in different communities of practice, whether you're a part of one or the other, or even both, if you can draw on kind of different examples from others, it certainly helps others to connect to the material, and then it allows like that expansion to happen much quicker than it would in a different experience.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Since we kind of talked about the identity part of it, so there's also a quote talking in general about participation and non-participation is on page 168. So they were saying the mix of participation and non-participation through which we define our identities reflects our power as individuals and the communities to define and affect our relations to the rest of the world. They have kind of 6 different aspects. They mentioned how this mix of participation, non-participation can shape the fundamental aspects of our lives. Just take a couple as an example. One of them is saying, so it determines who we seek connections with and who we avoid. So kind of like either within or within the community practice or with your participation of other communities practice, you can choose who you associate with more, who you work with more, or who you try not to associate yourself that much with. Kind of thinking about last week's conversation, someone talked about, so a lot of that is built on trust as well. So you've worked with this person before, you trust them, so you're more likely to participate again with them versus the other way around.
I'd just like to add something because you mentioned identity and also the participation in these communities of practice. A quote that I found on page 149 talks about identity as a negotiated experience. It says we define who we are by the ways we experience ourselves through participation, as well as by the ways we and others reify ourselves. So, you know, as we make something, you know, that's abstract become more concrete, you know, just by simply having experiences with other participants, that's when we're going to be creating our identities. It's through those experiences.
I totally agree. And on page 207, I found the quote, "Identity is a locus of social selfhood, and by the same token, a locus of social power. On one hand, it's the power to belong, to be a certain person, to claim a place with the legitimacy of membership. And on the other, it is the vulnerability of belonging to, identifying with, and becoming part of some communities that contribute to defining who we are and thus have a hold on us." You know, I think that's really part of our question that we're looking at for this week. You know, as a member of a community, I have the ability, if I am trusted and respected in my community, I have the ability to help people who are not in our community to come in. You know, I can be the broker, like Kelly discussed last week, and help people enter into the community. I think about that a lot at my job, and when people are trying to get a position within higher education, you know, they typically, or in a business, it always helps if you know somebody in the business. But, you know, as we're part of this identity, sometimes it's hard. You know, I work for a community college, but I really like a 4-year school that is in my community. And sometimes there's that disconnect because we're competing for the same students. And so while I view myself as a LOPER, which is the University of Nebraska at Kearney, I also know that my alliance is with Central Community College because that's where my job is. And so it sometimes can cause a conflict.
Right, and I agree with that totally too. Just being in a smaller setting, it kind of it encourages you to kind of think outside the box and think a little deeper. And I'll even kind of take it back to on page 73. I found something that kind of spoke to me. And it's just stated, the first characteristic of practice as a source of coherence of community is with mutual engagements, and that practice doesn't exist in the abstract. It exists because people are engaged in actions whose meanings they negotiate with another. So, you know, kind of simply said, it's engage, you know, no matter where, what level, and really act like you care. And I think this is a good pointer for me to, you know, positively influence my own communities of practice, because I personally know that I'm more engaged and I get more out of it if I feel like others are as well. And if it's something that you're involved in just to be involved in, you know, kind of on a separate note, it's harder to kind of hang on and to make those connections. So this one spoke to me a little bit more just because it was more intentional than some of the other quotes I read.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So I feel like throughout our conversation, we kind of mentioned all the three characteristics of what 3 dimensions of the community practice. So we kind of talk about community of mutual engagement. So we want to be engaged with each other and creating new knowledge, new things through the interaction. We talked about the negotiated enterprise and the repertoire of negotiable resources accumulated over time. So do we want to just kind of close it off with another quote that really spoke to you, that you really resonate with, that can connect to your practice?
Sorry, you can go.
Okay.
Go for it. Sorry.
I'm sorry. One thing that I really liked on page 176 was talking about imagination. And it says imagination is an important component of our experience of the world and our sense of place in it. It can make a big difference for our experience of identity and the potential for learning inherent to our activities. So to me, it's really interesting because Wagner shares a story about 2 stonecutters. One of them who someone asked them, you know, what they were doing. One said that they were cutting out perfectly formed square bricks, and the other one was building a cathedral. They were engaging in the same activity. They're both stonecutters, but one of them had a sense of what he was doing at the moment, and the other one saw the bigger picture. So I think that we might all be members of the same community of practice, but it's really important to be aligned in our common vision, and that will ultimately expand to our broader configuration of networks as well.
I found that quote really interesting also. One of the quotes that I really liked was on page 155. The exposure to the field of pragmatic trajectories is likely to be the most influential factor shaping the learning of newcomers. In the end, it is members, by their very participation, who create the set of possibilities to which newcomers are exposed as they negotiate their own trajectories. This really had me thinking about as I'm bringing on new employees into my college, and I'm working with new faculty members. Really, we as members of our communities, whether it's at our employment or in organizations, how we welcome and how we draw in those newcomers really impacts whether or not they stay and how involved they become. Just, we have that ability, and if we engage with them and we show them the benefits, they can take and do great things within our organizations and communities.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that one. That's a great quote. And kind of almost just a piggyback to that, not so much a quote, but going back to kind of the 6 different aspects of our lives with participation and non-participation. The 4th, talking about with whom we seek connections and whom we avoid, is something that kind of resonated with me more so, because in my personal environment, it seems pretty evident that it's very, you get to pick who you work with and who you don't work with. And it goes into kind of another important quote that I try to use with my staff is, solve the problem, not just the symptoms. It's almost like you avoid a few of the major things that involve the problem, but you take care of maybe 1 or 2 little symptoms, but the problem's still there. So it almost was encouraging for me to see that piece. So I knew that, don't just be comfortable with the connections that you currently have, but think outside the box and don't avoid, other participation opportunities, and stay with what you know. It's get outside the box to really encompass everything that there is, to form kind of that positive influence and have a well-rounded perspective on everything. So kind of a little bit off topic, but piggybacking nonetheless.
Yeah, so I think we're coming towards the end of or maybe even a little bit over 10 minutes. There's anything that anybody else want to add, or are we ready to just conclude this conversation?
I think we've had a great conversation.
Yeah. So again, before you end, I just want to put out one last quote that since we're talking about participation and the broader network this week, is actually at the very beginning of the book at page 7. It talks about placing the focus on participation has broad implications for what it takes to understand and support learning. So for us, since we're talking about individual participation, it means that learning is an issue of engaging in and contributing to the community of the practice of their community. So essentially, I think I picked this up through all our themes. A big part of this participation and contribution is through the engagement with it.
I agree. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you.